Good afternoon, guys. Thanks for your patience. Ken at Tortoise Capital. This is the Saturday Q&A podcast for Tortoise Capital on September 19th, 2020. We're going to continue with our series on 37 strategies, just hitting the highlights of that developmental document. So the first one we want to talk about here is number 7, position sizing risk as 1R versus the execution stop as 1R. So this comes from the following experience that I've had teaching this stuff. And it comes down to the psychology of our brain. There's an optimistic mind, and there's a pessimistic mind, and then there is the practical, reasonable mind. And in a workshop, if I ask you the question, if I could give you a system that was annualized at 200% per year, how much risk would you could you take? Or what would be the maximum drawdown that you could tolerate and still trade that system? So go ahead and commit to a number on your page right now. It turns out that the number is 50%. The average of 100 plus people that I've asked that question to said, well, if you could give me a system that I had confidence would return 200% a year, I could tolerate a 50% max drawdown before I would stop trading it. So is that reasonable? I think it is, because it represents a 4-to-1 reward to risk ratio, that if you could get 200% per year, that you could tolerate a 50% drawdown. If you look at accredited investors, who are placing the speculative money in their account into hedge funds, pretty savvy investors. If you look at the stats on that, the stats will show you that at minus 10% drawdown, people bail out of the fund. So it turns out that with our optimistic mind, that 50% is what we think we could tolerate. And in the real world, a 10% drawdown is what makes actual people bail. And those people were putting money into hedge funds, which had some stats which could show something like that. But as soon as they experienced a 10% drawdown, then they were out. Now, when I've asked this question, question number 1, if I ask this a different way, if I just ask, what drawdown percentage makes you bail? It generally comes down to about a 10%. So there's something about 10% that really matters psychologically to the human brain, which does not look at reward and risk as linear functions, but they are emotional functions. And I think it has to do with this idea here, that we have an optimistic brain, which, if you can persuade it of a really good reward, then it makes an estimate on how much risk would be reasonable. And that's actually a reasonable risk. We call this the R. The reasonable brain says that a 50% drawdown is worth tolerating in order to hold out for the 200% per year of reward. But it turns out that neither one of these brains is making the actual fear-induced decision. The fear-induced decision is coming from the pessimistic brain, which simply says, you know what, if I started with 100 and I lost 10%, I'm down to 90%. Well, I have to make plus 11% on 90 to get back up to 100, and that's tolerable. But if I lose 20 and I'm at 80, I now have to gain 25% on 80 just to get back to 100. So there's something about the intuitive fear-based statistics of our lizard brain, the risk brain, which says that 10% really matters. So the point that I want to make is that there's probably a 5-to-1 difference in risk judgment between the pessimistic brain and the optimistic brain. So let me put it to you in another frame of reference. So when you're deciding how much to risk on tortoise patterns or on anybody's pattern, so your the dollars that you're going to risk on a new pattern, how much should I risk on a new pattern? Even if you have satisfied the reasonable brain by looking at evidence and stats is what convinces the reasonable brain. Even the reasonable brain, though, is not the brain that's making the risk decision when times get tough. So even though your optimistic brain was convinced by the presentations and your reasonable brain was convinced by evidence and statistics, and even that this could come from back testing, paper trading, forward trading with small size, whatever it takes to convince you in your rational brain that the briefing, that the advertising was a good idea. The only thing that convinces your pessimistic brain is the scoreboard. And that means lately. And 10% seems to be a significant trigger, not the 50% of gains that you're or the 50% loss you could tolerate up here based on a 200% gain. That 5-to-1 says that that there's a real difference in how these portions of our brain are wired with respect to risk. So always start at 1/5 of what you think is reasonable. So if I thought that I could afford to risk $500 per trade because I had seen evidence and my reasonable brain was convinced, and I had seen some marketing copy that this thing was good, because I know how my lizard brain works, I would just instantly take 1/5 of that and score it at 100. And say I'm willing to risk 100 on forward trading in order to respect the power of that fear brain, that pessimistic brain, because what I want to do is I have a set of rules in this new system that I haven't internalized yet. I haven't internalized that rule yet. I haven't seen it trading forward. I don't have any experience with it. So in order to be fair to that rule set, I have to get a large number of trades. To get a large number of trades, it's possible that I could see a 10% drawdown. I know that that's true, but my willingness to exit even sooner, or even exit the rule set at 200, is going to be much more likely if I'm using what is probably the max reasonable. I think of that as the maximum reasonable size. So when my optimistic brain and my rational brain are convinced, this leads me to want to say, what is the maximum bet that I think I could get away with? And if that number is 500, then that's the one that puts me at most risk, because if I get a bad streak, I'm much more likely to trigger and start adjusting the rules and changing my mind and suffering extraordinary stress early in the drawdown. So I want to start with a risk bet that is clearly small enough that I can afford the psychology to let that rule set become what it is. Now, there's a way that I build this in to my recommendations now on position sizing versus execution risk. So I want to talk about that. The way I have been teaching you on the supported spring crossing, when it's going like this, we think that's going to be the play. And we get in here. And we take that initial risk down here by the PSAR and at the belly of the RL10. And this is our initial risk. I say make that equal to 0.2 of a position sizing risk, so that when I'm judging my 2-to-1 and I base it off a position sizing risk, if this thing just goes immediately south against me and I get out, I've only lost 0.2. And that means it feels like an insignificant loss. And in fact, because I was aiming for 2 full position sizing risks, this little loss of a 0.2 means that, I had basically a 10-to-1 reward to risk ratio on the basis of the position sizing risk and the 2R gains. So that little 0.2 initial risk means that I'm only losing a crumb. I'm not losing the maximum 1R loss that I initially envisioned. Here's why that's important. I've been telling you guys from the start about this wu-wei exit, how you just, you frame your trade and you get your entry and off it goes. And I say, keep that initial risk until the PSAR gets 1, 2, 3 above the entry, right? And that's the no lose plus dinner for 2. I have been saying, keep the wu-wei exit in place. Don't trail it, because what will happen is, if this was a full 1R position sizing loss, you don't want to wait for this thing to come all the way back and then suffer maybe some kind of slippage. So what has typically been happening is that people who are trading with the maximum position size are taking that exit, are taking an exit, not a rule-based exit, but are just using discretion and panic to make an emotional decision and exit inside the noise. Everything down here, everything between the entry and the programmed exit at the PSAR or the belly of the RL10, all of this is noise. So if you're letting emotions interrupt this trade experiment and exit before you even get a clear signal, it can only be because there's some internal chimpanzee who is saying, fear, can't tolerate the heat because I know that I was trading at too high a level of risk. So this experiment doesn't get a chance to unfold, and you end up changing your mind and following your emotions before you get a clear signal. So in order to put this little chimpanzee in a box, we trick him by saying, look, that initial risk is only 0.2 R, a minus 0.2 R loss. And there's really 10 R available. So in order to be able to get that potential 10 R, you have to be able to tolerate that heat. And you have to say, leave, here's the entry, or here's the stock, there's the entry. You got to leave that PSAR, you got to leave that initial risk in until the PSAR has climbed 3 dots out of this noise. Then you can be a chimp and lock in the gains. And that's where you get the no lose plus dinner for 2. Well, what this means is that a lot of times on that initial trade frame, there's 1 unit of risk, we get 1, 2, and somewhere around the third entry or the third risk box up, we start seeing that thing start to falter. And so you cash that and you get plus and a plus. That gives you a 0.4 R win. So now when you take a look at your own psychology, what you realize is that sometimes you're losing 0.2 and sometimes you're gaining 0.4. So you got all these tiny little chips being stacked and counted. And each one of them feels trivial. But when you use the law of large numbers, this really builds your equity curve. And you're able to follow the rules much better. So that is the relationship now between position sizing and execution, and it's tied to psychology. Okay, so that's what I want to say about that one. Next one up: trading is a skill-based activity. This is the last one I'm going to be able to do. I got to leave here in about 5 minutes, and I'll try to get further. So trading is a skill-based activity. In the hybrid trading workshop, Alex McKinnon, and then on YouTube and in the home study courses for the swing course, Alex McKinnon has done a really nice video on his experience with internalizing the lessons of the swing trading, and he got the law of large numbers. What he found, so he had built a simulator from Forex Tester. I think it's up to Forex Tester 3 now. And it's a simulator that's designed for Forex, but it also works for equities really nicely. And so what he did was he had come to a workshop and done all the work. And so he did all the training. And then he went home and practiced. So he was working on conscious effort. And he noticed that in practice, he was not always applying the rules from the workshop, that in this exercise, there was still a lot of internal talk that he had to work his way through. And it wasn't until somewhere around trade number 650 that he noticed in his practice, he was no longer making no tiny errors, that the system now fit him, that he had learned to silence the internal chimp, and to, by studying these things, he found the little adjustments that made it satisfying and easy to exercise. And so in the first 600 trades, he would kind of get something that looked like this, his equity curve or his R multiples. And so it was, positive expectancy, but there was large variation around that average. And every little drawdown was painful. But that after about number 650, the 650 to 1000, that curve got better and the variation was smaller, that there were no longer these big pullbacks. By the same token, Um, Kim Anderson of the Anderson regression line stretch, which is P6 in the RLCO framework. She came to one of our annual research weekends, and she showed her equity curve was looking like this. And she would, go through a really good streak, and then maybe market conditions would change, and then she would end up giving back, this much, and then she'd go, tighten up her shot group and work through the basics, and then things would go better, and then she would suffer that drawdown. So there was always a series of higher lows and higher highs. But what she didn't like was this, the drawdown. It's almost like a panic reaction and manic depression. Big gains, big losses, and it nets out to some steady state. But the roller coaster ride was not satisfying. And so I just said, well, Kim, stop losing money. And so she implemented ruthless risk management. That once she narrowed down, on a given trade, if she was framing the trade here, dang it, come on. If she would frame the trade here and then put her initial risk right here, she was seeking to minimize the amount of information that it would require to invalidate the trade. So then if that thing would take off and she would get the move, if it made some gains and then started to fall back, sometimes she would adjust that stop to give it more room. So once she learned that, hey, what I got to do is have ruthless risk management in here, that she was ironclad on respecting that initial risk and then quickly moving her risk out to, you guessed it, no lose plus dinner for two. And then as this thing would climb the stack, as this thing would, make some gains and start pulling back, she would find, very much like the sniper and the Wu-Wei exit, she would find ways to ratchet up and lock in the gains. And then through ruthless risk management, her equity curve now started to look like, instead of coming all the way back, it began to look like this. So what used to be a roller coaster now became a lot smoother, and the drawdowns were smaller, and the recovery was quicker, and the slope of the regression line was better than it was over here. Now, I should probably draw it like that. So instead of a slight performance over zero, because she was taking care of the risk side, her now equity curve was now looking like that. And all because she was being very professional in how to manage the stops on individual trades and treating each one the same, not letting. She was kind of taking the position, hey, I've been doing so good, I can relax some of my exit criteria because I'm developing real skills. And once she got that idea out of her head, by using ruthless risk management, she was able to get herself straightened out. So this movie on ruthless risk management by Alex McKinnon is really an important one, because it talks about how both of these guys needed to go through, many hundreds. I'm going to just call it 1,000. You should just plan on doing 1,000 trades. And then each trade that you're taking, you realize this is just one of a large bucket of 1,000 trades. So you just got to do that one right. and then put it in the bin, and then take the next trade, do it correctly, throw it into the bin. You're not going to make your fortune on any one trade in our strategies. What you're going to do is perfect your trading techniques so that each trade you're getting more and more value out of, and it's all getting thrown into this giant big bucket, this great big bowl of holding. And there's 1,000 trades in there. And you're going to get the expectancy of a positive expectancy system. And that's going to help you minimize those drawdowns and smooth out your equity curve. And it's nothing more than getting in the weight room and doing lots of repetitions or carving lots of wooden bowls. You know, that comes out to be the essential idea of the video of Know Your Edge. That's on YouTube. And in that, I said, you got to know what your edge is in the market. And you want to accumulate as many small edges as you can and respect each one of them and pay attention, because it's hard to find an edge. And once you get them, you want to use it and respect it and care for it. And then accumulate those edges. And stay in the areas where you have an edge. I don't have an edge when it comes to doing future estimates of earnings and trying to sort all that stuff out and battle against millions of MBAs out there. That's not where my edge is. My edge is in self-control, systems management, routines, do routine things routinely, and then analysis and descriptive statistics and production management. These are all things that, and detailed planning and emotional control. Let's call it emotional management. That I can execute systems that I have rehearsed and trained and visualized. So I can visualize and I can train and I can rehearse. So all of these things are my edges. Yeah, and there's systems in there. So I know where all my edges are. I know where my strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are coming from. And I make sure that I use my strengths to seize opportunities. Okay, so that's everything I want to cover for today. That was 6, 7, 8, and 9. Now let me do one more. The tortoise histogram. So you've heard me say this many, many times. So when I look at a large collection of data results, there's 3 things that I look at. I go look at wherever you put -1R, position sizing R, and the first thing I check is, were there any losses worse than 1R? And if there are, I want to know why. Because if you can keep all your losses less than 1R, position sizing R, then that means that you have the skill to identify a risk, a manageable risk, and you can manage that risk, that you didn't let that managed risk get beyond the area you thought you could manage. So that's a good skill. The second thing that I look at is between -1R and +2R, does this curve look like a normal curve? Meaning that it looks like it was created by a natural process. And I want that whole series of trades between -1 and +2, I want that to be positive expectancy. If that's the case, then I'm getting paid to learn. And then so that's the second thing that I look at. Does the area under the curve in that histogram between -1 and 2, does it look normal-ish, which means that it's a regular, repeatable process? And is it positive expectancy? And then the third thing I look at is there some evidence of trades beyond +2? And if so, I want to be open to gifts, meaning that I know what to do when I get abnormal profits. I know how to cash them. But the reason I draw a distinction between the gains of 0 to 2 and greater than 2 is that I don't want these to make me think that suddenly I'm all skillful, and that I just realized that there were other traders and other time frames that came in and kept moving my position higher. It wasn't anything that I saw in the initial setup. It's just that other people, for their own reasons, decided to keep pushing it. So if I can see those three elements of in a tortoise histogram, that's what the tortoise patterns and systems and strategies should get you, is something that is a very tightly controlled 1R, normal between -1 and 2, and then open to the possibility of fat right tails. Now, that may not be necessarily exactly the way you always want to trade, but you should know what your system is supposed to get. Your system should produce an ideal histogram, like a long-term trend following system that has low win rate but high payoff on wins, on infrequent wins, should look like this. So if this was 0, his high losing rate should end up producing things where I don't take anything worse than 1R, but I'll probably have a lot of losses in here. And I'll probably have a lot of, these minor wins, and then have a couple really big wins way out here. The problem for me on this kind of a histogram, where most of your gains are coming from a few massive winners, is I look at, what's the reliability of that? It looks to me like this was really more random, and that your setup had nothing to do with putting you in a position to experience that. It's just that every so often an old blind pig finds a piece of corn on the ground. But this is what a long-term trend following that relies on big payoffs on a few wins has to tolerate long losing streaks and make sure you don't lose anything more than 1R. It misses a lot of this normal process inside here. What I want to do is get from a setup that I get some that look like this, some like this, and some like this, and some like this. So there's a lot of things in this area. And then only very few get out here beyond 2R. So I'm looking for that histogram again that looks like, here's the average, and here's that -1. I want to see a nice strong histogram between -1 and +2. That tells me that the initial setup I'm getting is frequently correct. And in this space, I'm positive expectancy, but I'm still, because of the 2R battle drill and re-entry conditions and adding positions, I have some things that are beyond 2+, and all of those are good and gravy, but I'm basing all my decisions on how to improve the entries and manage exits in here. Because as long as I'm getting lots of opportunities and it's positive expectancy, I'm getting paid to manage some of these bigger wins. And this is where that sniper exit is going to be a big payoff. Okay, so that's what I mean about know the tortoise histogram, but also know your own histogram. So whatever style you end up deciding to do, you should know what kind of histogram that produces, and then you can study the histogram to see how your rule sets are performing. But you can only do that if you're following the rules. If you're always changing the rules, then your histogram is worthless, because there's no one common set of rules that's driving the display of information about your results. You have to have stable rules in order to be able to do histogram analysis. Otherwise, you're just whistling in the dark. Okay. All right. So they're calling for me to go. I got to run. I'll get this recorded and posted, and I'll try to get some more of these later tonight after we get back, and I'll plop all this into Patreon, and then tomorrow night, Sunday night, we'll do the review of any trade frames that you've posted in the chat room, and off we'll go, and then we'll be ready for Monday. So take good care, and we will see you in the chat room.